Good day. In our last video, we were just talking about Plato's Euthyphro, and we saw Socrates becoming the pupil of Euthyphro. Euthyphro doing this crazy, controversial action, bringing his own father to trial for murder, which is completely against Athenian culture. And Socrates looking at him and saying, you know what? Maybe you're onto the right thing, Euthyphro. Maybe you are doing the right action. But the only way that you would be able to know that you're right is if you are far more advanced, far more wise than anyone else in the city of Athens. And that's precisely what Euthyphro seems to believe about himself, that he is in fact wise when no one else is. Socrates then says, I will become your pupil. And he only has one question. What's the question he has to ask Euthyphro? What is piety? So if you know more about what the truly pious thing is to do with regard to your own father and potentially committing murder, then you must know more about piety than anyone else. And he asked that one question, what is piety? And that's really what this video is in part about, is thinking about that what is question and how important it is. Because that's really the only thing Socrates wants to know. The rest of this dialogue in Euthyphro is all about Socrates trying to figure out what is the definition of piety. And do we get a definition of piety? No. We actually don't. And so when we get to the end of the dialogue, we're not going to discuss every aspect of that dialogue here, but we'll see by the time we get to the end, we don't get to that definition. And this is really important for us to understand Plato, that he really puts an amazing priority on our grasp of those definitions, right? That unless you can grasp the definition of a thing, you don't really know anything about that thing at all, right? So this is fundamental to understanding Plato, that if you don't know the definition, you don't know anything, right? He would argue you can't really know examples of that thing, and you can't know any other properties of a thing if you don't grasp that definition. In fact, you're blind. Even if you have some type of true opinion about something, even if you're correct in your views, you're blind. And so this is this interesting thing. Again, Euthyphro might have been onto something fundamental here as we were talking. Euthyphro might actually be correct. However, as we'll see, Euthyphro is not in fact wise, though he may be correct. He may have some type of true opinion, but he may still be blind in that. And what Socrates wants is he wants us not to be blind. He wants us to see. And how do we see? We see through grasping the fundamental definitions. And so this is where Socrates is at. He says, okay, Euthyphro, you're making this claim that you know what piety truly is and that no one else does, right? Euthyphro, you claim that you're doing the pious action and that no one else really knows what piety is. So tell me, what is piety? Answer the question, what is piety? And that's all Euthyphro has to do. But until you can say what piety is in general, Socrates says you can't recognize a definition of it. Like, for instance, if I said amongst these shapes, right, which one is the rectangle, right, then you might not have any way of knowing until I tell you what a rectangle is. Now, we all kind of know what a rectangle is, and so you might have a better chance of doing that. But what if we're talking about something more difficult, like piety? Or what if we're talking about something, as we'll see in the Republic, like justice? Until you know what justice is, how can you make a claim about what is an example of justice and what isn't? Let's look at a question that's much less controversial. Let's look at this question, or maybe it's more controversial. I don't know. This is a question I will ask you to think about. Is cheerleading a sport? What did you guys think? Is cheerleading a sport? Well, if you're trying to answer, is cheerleading a sport? We'll look in the conversations. I've heard lots of people say lots of different things about whether or not cheerleading would be a sport. And I've heard people make distinctions like, oh, cheerleading would be a sport if it's cheerleading is more a sport if you're like looking at two different types of cheerleading. Like if you're looking at competitive cheerleading, then competitive cheerleading, then it's a sport. But if you look at like just versus cheerleading where you're just, cheering for a team, I guess isn't that what cheerleading is supposed to be, cheering for a team. But if you're just sort of like being a group of a spirit, then it's not a sport, right? So just, so cheering in of itself, if I can only write, Cheering is not a sport, right? And so, and I've heard people argue, oh, like cheerleaders, they're incredibly athletic, right? They train and the things like that. And there's all, and we could go through and talk about all different kind of characteristics in trying to decide if something's a sport. But no matter what, as you're trying to make arguments about whether or not cheerleading is a sport, what are you really trying to do? You're saying that cheerleading shares characteristics common to sports, right? But just because it shares certain characteristics that are common to sports, does that make cheerleading a sport? It would have to share the most important characteristics of what makes a sport a sport. And the fun thing about this debate, and I'd be curious to see what you guys come up with, that when we realize it, we can't really answer this question until we get the definition of a sport. We'll never settle the dispute. I mean, even if you identify certain characteristics, there's plenty of things that are competitive that aren't sports, right? Like right now, if you turn on the Food Network, there's inevitably some type of competitive cooking show. Is competitive cooking a sport? I don't know. And there's plenty of things that are athletic that aren't sports necessarily. And there's plenty of things that there's plenty of sports that don't seem all that athletic at all. I mean, like even like golf. I mean, I suppose there's a certain amount of there's definitely absolutely athleticism that's part of it, but you don't have to be an athlete to be a golfer, right? So there's all kinds of questions here, and I'm actually I have some beliefs myself about whether cheerleading is a sport or not, but that's not the important thing. Is to realize that if you're going to answer this question, is cheerleading a sport, you need to know what a sport is. Know what a sport is, right? You need to be able to answer the question, what is a sport? And this is fundamentally what Socrates is doing in all of his conversations. He's asking people, what is something? What is piety? When you read Plato's Republic, he's asking, what is justice, right? In another text called the Laches, Socrates is asking Laches, what is courage, right? And Socrates says that until you know what courage is, then you can't identify a single example of someone who is courageous, because you don't really know what courage is to be able to point out the example. Just like if you didn't know what a rectangle was, you can never point one out. And just like if you don't really know what a sport is, you'll never really know whether cheerleading is a sport or whether anything else is a sport, right? What will you have until you're able to answer this question, like what is a sport? All you have nothing but opinion. Nothing but opinion about the topic, right? There's nothing but opinion. It's not knowledge, right? It's not actually knowing anything, right? And so that's this fundamental thing that Socrates is challenging here. When Socrates is encountering Euthyphro has probably all kinds of opinions, some which may even be correct. Remember how we said in the last video that even Euthyphro might have a true opinion about certain important things. But just true opinion of itself is not knowledge. You need to actually know. So there's a famous line here. Let's look at just a line here in the Republic really quick. When we're reflecting on this belief of Socrates about the priority of grasping the definitions of things, we'll see here at the end of Book 1, the very, very end of Book 1 of the Republic, which is around page 35. If I could get there, I'll look at that. There I am. If you're looking at our translation, if you're looking at the marginal numbers, this is around 354 C almost, just the end of B to 354 C, right? And here we have this famous line that's really, really important in trying to understand Socrates on this what is question. And Socrates says this, the end of Book 1. And here, again, we haven't talked about Book 1 of the Republic at all, but Socrates is engaging in this conversation about justice with Polemarchus and then another guy, Thrasymachus. But at the end, what do we see? Socrates says, hence, the result of the discussion, so far as I'm concerned, is that I know nothing. For when I do not know what justice is, I'll hardly know whether it is a kind of virtue or not, or whether a person who has it is happy or unhappy. Socrates says, what? I know nothing. I know nothing. Why? Because I don't know what justice is. In in the Plato's Republic, Socrates sitting there talking to these folks about justice, and they fail to arrive at a definition of justice. And therefore, what does Socrates have based on that conversation? Nothing but opinions about the nature of justice. Talking to Euthyphro about piety, what are we left with? But nothing but opinions about what piety truly is, right? And so in order to know, you must grasp that definition. And that's the most important thing. That is the fundamental act of wisdom, right? Wisdom begins with definitions. And so if you have no definition of the thing, then you can't possibly be wise. We'll see that for Socrates, that once you can grasp the true definition of a thing, it cascades to full knowledge of examples and characteristics and all kinds of stuff. That's really important. Again, we'll explore that in more detail in another lecture. But I want to turn to this concept of knowledge again. And that just to deepen us talking about what Socrates really means by knowledge here. We said, of course, that knowledge is going to mean grasping the definition. But in another text, and this is not a text that you have to read, this is another dialogue called the Theatetus. And here in the Theatetus, Socrates is talking about, well, what it means to know, and amongst other things. And we get this beautiful definition of knowledge, of what it means to know, and that it becomes an important definition of knowing that's discussed for many philosophers in the history of philosophy after Socrates. So here we go. In the Theaetetus, Socrates calls knowledge justified true belief. So when we say that knowledge relies on grasping the definition, we're going to say and add to that knowledge really is a kind of justified true belief. So what we need to do is we need to sort of analyze these words. Let's analyze the three terms of justified true belief. So, and we don't necessarily have to do that in order. Let's think about the word true. Let's think about the word justified. Let's think about the word belief, right? So when we say something is true, what do we mean? What do we mean? In order for you to have knowledge, you must somehow think something that is in fact true. What makes something true, right? What makes something true? What makes something or some thought, something, some thought true? What do you think? Well, that's actually an interesting philosophical problem, and different philosophers will talk about it in different ways. But in part, it has this dimension that the sort of words match reality. That's the way I'll put it. This is called the adequation understanding of truth. That somehow the words that are spoken coincide, match up correctly with the reality itself. So if I said, hey, it's raining outside right now, guess what? It isn't. And so what I said is not true. However, if it was raining right outside right now, then what I said was true. So the words have to match reality, this adequation, this notion of truth. So interestingly, notice though, that when we talk about words matching reality, that what would we call the philosophical question that had to do with what's really real and what it means to exist, what being is and the natures of things. Do you guys remember? That was metaphysics. And so interestingly, there's a kind of metaphysical dimension about truth. We said really the ideas of what truth is in some ways is an epistemological question, but we realize that truth will inevitably lead to metaphysics as well. That to say something is true is to say something about reality itself, which means truth claims are metaphysical claims to a large extent. Okay, so that gets kind of interesting. Now, what's justified? Justified, what makes something justified? Well, there needs to be sufficient reasons to support the true thought, right? Or the true words, right? And there needs to be sufficient reasons, and those sufficient reasons are going to come in the form of argument, right? Now, argument is not where two people fight to try to hurt each other. So sometimes that's a fight. An argument is where you present reasons. And so you need to have some type of correct argument to be justified in that idea, right? And then, and what counts as real justification? To some extent, we didn't really talk about this before, but this is going to be connected to logic, right? But also be connected to epistemology, right? about studying of what it means to know. Logic is the study of right reasoning. Epistemology is really just has to do with knowledge in general, like what it means to know. But what kind of arguments are sufficient to make a belief in something and or to be justified in thinking that you're correct in something. And then finally, belief. What do we mean by belief? Now, belief is kind of an interesting dimension here to add. That when we're talking about belief, you think something is correct, right? You think some idea is true or correct, right? And so that gets kind of interesting there too. To believe means that you think you've got something that gets to reality itself. And in some ways, that belief can almost always be somewhat psychological, right? But according to Socrates, you need to have all three of these things in order to have knowledge. You need to actually know something about reality itself. You need to have sufficient reasons to justify that correct idea itself, and you need to have some belief in it. And he would argue, and he suggests that if you lack any of these three things, then you don't actually have knowledge. If you have good reasons to believe that you're correct, but they're not actually true, that can't be knowledge. If you know something that is in fact true, but you don't have sufficient reasons to back it up, then that also is not considered knowledge. Now, it's a little bit, what if you were to combine the true and the justified, but took away belief? Could you be right about something, have good reasons for it, but still not believe it? Would you have knowledge? He still argues no. And that's kind of, that's a little bit more difficult thing. I can imagine like a scientist who like has an experiment that arrives at a result and they have this conclusion that is correct, but somehow the scientist still just doesn't believe it. Then Socrates would even say there that the person doesn't know. True knowledge has all of those things. Now, if we think about the idea of definitions, right? For Socrates, that a definition, right, grasping that definition is essential. That grasping the definition has to be something that's true. You need to get to the true reality of that thing, right? And you need to somehow, and grasping that definition is, in fact, the justification for any other conclusion that you would draw whatsoever. That you're justified in having that definition. Now, what gets really, really problematic, and we'll see later on when we continue studying Socrates, is really what are these definitions and how do you know that you actually have the correct definitions of things gets really hard. What we tend to see in Socrates is we tend to see him pointing out reasons that we know that we don't actually have the definition, right? And so how do you know that you don't know that have the definition? We're going to see here is that there's going to be incoherence in our ideas. Incoherence meaning things that contradict each other, that don't work together. And so this incoherence in our ideas shows that we don't have the definition of a thing. And that's something that we'll see as we talk about the Socratic method in another video. So when we read Plato's Euthyphro, what did you notice when you got to the end? Well, it did not end with a beautiful statement of knowing the definition of things. Plato's Euthyphro ends with Euthyphro saying he's got to go, right? It says, Socrates says, this great long speech about Euthyphro. Here, if we're looking at the end on page 13, this is marginal line 15D. Socrates says, so we must begin again from the beginning to examine what the pious is, since as far as I'm concerned, I'm determined not to give up until I understand it. Do not scorn me, but applying your mind in every way, tell me the truth now more than ever, because you know it, if anybody does. And like Proteus, you cannot be released until you tell me, because unless you knew clearly about the pious and the impious, there is no way you would ever pursue your own father for murder on behalf of a hired laborer. That's, like I said, there's all kind of weird translations of that term. But instead you would have been afraid before the gods and ashamed before men to run the risk of conducting matter improperly. But as it is, I'm sure that you think you have a clear knowledge of the pious and the impious. So tell me, great Euthyphro, and do not conceal what you think it is. And what does Euthyphro say? Well, some other time then, Socrates, because I'm in a hurry to get somewhere and it's time for me to go. The Republic Book 1 ends with not knowing. The Euthyphro ends with not knowing. And we'll look at that consequence, that idea that unless you have a definition, you know nothing. We'll look at that again as we look at really the Socratic method in a broader scope in our next lecture. Guys, have a beautiful day, and I'll see you on the next lecture.